Hi, I'm Murray-Leach. I'm the Chief Executive for the Energy Efficiency Council. I'm really delighted to be here at the Australian Future Energy Summit, presenting about demand and supply. So, we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to kick into a fair amount of material. First, I'm going to talk about where energy markets at right now, and the general issue of balancing supply and demand. Then we're going to talk about energy markets into the future. So, the first thing to note is that in energy markets, if you think about an off-grid house and they want to cool it during the summer, they're going to have to basically do that the cheapest way through a combination of demand and supply side measures. So if you had a very, very inefficient air conditioner and no insulation at all, you'd have to really oversize the generation unit in order to cool that house. And that'd be very, very expensive. At the same time, if you did a completely passive house, also probably pretty expensive. What you generally want to have is a good balance between energy supply and demand side technologies. If I just very briefly touch on the energy market itself. The energy market consists of generators, networks, which are the poles and wire companies and their monopolies, retailers, customers, and then some customers have distributed generation. What we've seen very recently is that electricity prices have risen astronomically. We've seen about a 70% rise in electricity prices between around sort of 2007 and 2013. It's really astonishing, and not only that, it's actually one of the fastest rates of growth of prices in the world. Now, some people have laid the blame at various doors, but really if you're an energy market expert, there's only one answer to that, and it's very largely expenditure on the poles and wires, the networks. And a global comparison by UBS found that not only was Australia the fastest rising in the world, but the network was the key driver. The reason for the over-expenditure on networks is that the peak projections were wrong. We thought the peak was going to grow, well, some companies thought the peak was going to grow much faster than it actually did. And that meant that they built a lot more poles and wires. They had to expand the capacity of the grid to meet that demand. What you can see is actually, the peak's actually about 15% lower, which ourselves and various other experts did actually warn people at the time. It's understandable that people didn't listen to these warnings, because if you look from 1960 to around 2010, 2007, electricity demand grew pretty consistently at over 2% per annum in the national electricity market, that's the East Coast, and the SWIS, which is the West Australian energy market. So what we can see is there was a really big drop in both peak but also in demand. This was caused by a huge number of factors, but really to simplify it, a lot of people say, well, it was because of PV, and PV's definitely been a factor. It's about 14% of the reduction in energy demand from centralised generation. And then of course a lot of people talk about the economy, and yes, we know that around 9% of the demand dropping out was actually caused by very large companies like the smelter, one of the smelters in New South Wales, closing down. But actually that was relatively modest. And then the economic slowdown in manufacturing was about another 14% of the reduction in demand. But a whopping 60% was due to energy efficiency, of which about half were standards, which were expected, and about 20% of people were responding to the energy prices rising very rapidly. Now, this is a very extreme case in Australia, and we've seen the fastest drop-off in demand growth. But it's actually very consistent in the United States, Europe, in China, in South Korea, in Thailand, in Brazil. You're expecting the rate of growth of electricity demand to really have dropped quite substantially over the last 20 years. And there's a number of reasons for that. People are just getting much smarter with the way that they use energy, and they're changing the way that their economy functions. It's much more a services economy. Now, we've got this massive overbuild in Australia now, so we have excess capacity. So some people say, well, why would we bother doing efficiency now? There's actually still some very, very good reasons to do energy efficiency. The first thing is it depresses the wholesale electricity price, which keeps electricity prices low for everyone. Secondly, it means you can avoid further grid investment, because even though we've got overbuild in some places, we still have peak growing in some areas of the grid. And so as a result, it reduces total electricity bills. It may push up the per unit network costs, but since you're using less energy, you actually pay exactly the same amount. So energy markets in the future, where are they going? The first thing is it's really, really hugely uncertain. So we have a lot of uncertainty about what people are actually going to be demanding in the future. But we always forget that people use electricity for a function. So what we're seeing is that they're really uncertain about what people want in the future. And a good example of that is televisions. About 10 years ago, plasma screen TVs came out. They were very, very energy hungry, and people had to massively upgrade the energy demand projections for households. But only a few years later, they brought out LED TVs, which service the same need that households wanted, which was a very big TV, but they do it with very, very, very little energy. So we need to be mindful that there's really big changes in technology. So technology can bring new services that people didn't think they want, which pushes up demand, but it can also result in significant efficiency, which reduces demand. We've also got uncertainties around how much PV people will install, which basically reduces grid source supply, and we have uncertainty about whether and what point electric vehicles will come on, because they will demand a lot of electricity, at the same time displacing a lot of oil, so there's some real benefits to that. In terms of energy supply, the first thing that's really important at the moment is gas prices in Australia are about to rise very, very rapidly. They're actually in the middle of rising very rapidly. Historical base is around $3.50 a gigajoule. We're expecting that to sort of somewhere between double and triple. Now, what that's going to do is, one hand, it's going to reduce the amount of gas generation, but B, it's going to increase the cost of peak generation. We also have a range of other uncertainties in the electricity sector. So one, we have uncertainty around gas, which is a major fuel, but we're also uncertain about how much wind and renewables we're going to have in the future, and the extent to which new renewable technologies will come on board, like geothermal and solar parks. And then the big one is energy storage, which can dramatically change the way we supply energy in the energy market. One of the really important things to note is we're actually hitting the end of the life for a huge number of assets, a lot of the coal plants. And if we replace them with a new coal plant, they're actually very, very expensive. The ones we've got right now are very cheap to run because they were built in the 1950s and 60s, largely. But there's actually, any new build is very expensive. So whether that's wind, solar, coal, it's actually all a lot more expensive. And what we've seen is models basically saying new builds a minimum of $75 per megawatt hour to supply, which is more than double the price at the moment. So what that really leads us to is some work from CSIRO that suggested demand was growing steadily, we overbuilt our capacity, which is the dotted line, but we're now in this period between 2009 and 2020 where we're not really sure. We've got PV coming on, it's quite a minor part of the market, but it's very disruptive, and in the same way the demand drop has in some ways relatively modest, but in other ways it's really been very disruptive to the market. But that's good, because we want to avoid building any further infrastructure, because in around the sort of mid-2020s, we don't know where the energy market's going to go. You could have electric vehicles and renewables, large-scale renewables supplying those electric vehicles. You could have a sort of a bit of a steady-as-she-goes energy market, or you could move to a situation where people basically abandon the grid and they combine PV, batteries, and on-site storage. So while some scenarios are more likely than others, we don't actually have certainty. So what that means is, to keep energy affordable, we really need to avoid further sunk costs in any supply-side infrastructure. And the reason for that is that stuff takes 30 years to pay back in a lot of cases, and we're not sure what the energy market's going to look like in 30 years. So it makes a lot more sense to do demand-side investments, which often only have a very, very short payback period. The second thing we need to do is reform for the 2020s, so reform now to get things ready for the 2020s, which better balance supply and demand, and do network reforms. So very quickly, looking at the energy market reform, balancing supply and demand, if we think about the off-grid house again, and we think about the barriers to doing supply or demand side solutions to that house, so they want to cool that house, what you realise is whether it's putting energy in by installing solar or diesel, or whether it's reducing demand by using energy efficiency technologies, insulation and similar sort of approaches, you actually see there's fairly similar barriers to both approaches. So one thing is information asymmetry. I'm not going to go into that, but basically if you provide efficiency labels for goods and services in buildings, that enables customers to buy more efficient buildings. So that effectively deals with that problem. Then you have a range of these other sort of classic barriers to energy efficiency that people talk about: imperfect information, bounded rationality, transaction costs, which basically means it takes time and hassle, and access to capital. What you realise is actually those barriers apply very equally to supply side and demand side technologies. So in that off-grid house, even though they don't have a sort of a grid, in fact, because they don't have a grid, you're actually going to find out they end up doing a much better balance between demand side and supply side technologies, which is probably going to be a much more cost-effective outcome. And ideally what they'll do is actually go and find an expert who'll do the work to balance up the supply and demand side technologies for them, giving them the cheapest outcome. However, when you come onto the grid, things change quite substantially. So those barriers we talked about, imperfect information, bounded rationality, transaction costs and access to capital, they still exist in the demand side, but we've effectively mandated them out on the supply side. Now there's some real benefits to that, but by mandating a role for retailers, by mandating a role for network companies that are monopolies, and by setting up the generation market in the way that we have, which they're all good things in many ways, what they do is they address imperfect information and bounded rationality, transaction costs and access to capital for the supply side, but not for the demand side. So you end up with this really substantial supply side bias. And this has been known since the PARE review, which is the COAG review of the energy market in 2002, but very little has been done. On top of that, we also have two other big distortions, imperfect pricing and misaligned incentives. So imperfect pricing is basically saying, well, people actually incur cost to build a network by using energy during those very, very short super peak times, just 1 or 2 days a year when it's very, very hot. But they actually pay on an average cost of the year. So they're not paying very cost-reflective price signals, which means that we're subsidising people with big air conditioners. So we can fix those. We can fix the tariffs and we can fix the misaligned incentives for the network companies. That's great, but we still actually have this demand side, supply side bias, which pushes us away from energy efficiency, which means we end up with a much more investment in supply than demand side solutions, and as a result, it's more expensive. So we need strong policies to correct that. Fundamentally, these are tariff reform in the way that we charge people for use of the electricity network, a demand response mechanism that allows energy users to basically benefit when they reduce their demand in peak times, reforming network regulations, energy efficiency certificate schemes, and support programs to help homes and businesses address the information barriers that they face. So thank you very much for your time today, and it's been a pleasure to be with you.